Dan, thanks for joining us today. This will be the first official episode of the VP Solution podcast. So I appreciate you making time to talk with me, talk with the people who will watch or listen to this. And today our topic will be about brokers. Tell us a bit about your background in the industry. We've worked together before, and that's our connection. But tell us about what you're doing now, some things about your background so those who don't know you yet get a chance to learn a bit about you today.
Awesome. Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity, Bryan, and I'm honored to be your first official guest on the VP Solution podcast. So, hi, everybody. I'm Dan Barnes. I have been in CPG in one way or another for a number of decades, going back to starting with the Coca-Cola bottling system in Florida. I worked on the brand side after that for a number of different beverage companies. And along the way started a journey in emerging brands and purpose-driven brands. And about 10 years ago, I started working on the agency side. So working on multiple brands, all in the emerging space, anywhere from pre-launch up to $7 or $8 million in revenue before they came over. Worked on pretty much everything around the within the four walls of the retail environment, and rose to lead a couple of sales teams with different agencies. And about a year ago, struck out on my own as a fractional sales VP strategy advisor.
Fantastic. And our paths crossed at one of those agencies a few years back. And we do very similar things. So one of the things I enjoy about what we're doing and a chance to spend time talking with other folks doing similar things is it hopefully will expand both of our reach. And something you and I have talked about is the emerging brands will find a lot of competent people, and they're true. There are some incompetent people who happen to stay around. None of us will ever admit to being the incompetent ones, but they're out there. But often it will come down not to skill set so much as maybe people finding a person they connect with in many ways personally, right? And so I think this is a chance for both of us to extend our personal reach by sharing, in this specific podcast about brokers, but give us a chance to let others get a feel for how we talk, act, our background knowledge, etc. So maybe you can pick up a new client at the end of this, we hope. So brokers brokers are our topic today because we've both experienced probably, especially working with emerging brands, and I have as well for the last number of years. We probably both ran across people who, when we meet them, they will have a very strong opinion about brokers without maybe even ever having worked with them. They're like, oh, my friend Joe, brokers are evil. Or my friend Stephanie, she said brokers will save your company, or whatever the case, right? The two extremes, one's horrible, we should never use them. The other is they're a godsend, they will solve all your problems. There's probably a happy medium, and that's what we'll talk about today.
Yeah, so when you think there's a lot of space, I would say there's a lot of space between those extremes for sure.
Definitely. I pick the extremes. So when you think, maybe the first time you thought about a broker, but today for that emerging brand who maybe has limited experience, maybe someone's running across this on LinkedIn or YouTube, and they have a CPG, a consumer packaged good product line, whether it's chips, beverage, supplement, whatever the case may be. When they hear the word broker, they might not have an understanding of that. But what is a broker, Dan? What is a broker?
So I think if I could back up just a couple of ticks there, I would say, there's definitely a baseline understanding, I think, and most people sort of understand a broker as responsible for the sales and administration of, in some cases, a really specific number of accounts. It could be a lot of accounts. It could be as few as one. But you're engaging that service for that relationship to manage the sales, not just securing the business, but the ongoing maintenance and management. So that's what I would say is sort of the baseline understanding of a broker. Where I think the difference between the extremes that we were talking about a minute ago is that broker is a term that a lot of people will come to and pour their own meaning into. And that's where I think there's a pretty big difference, and sort of what you can expect from a broker and tracking what you personally expect and trying to match it with what they can provide is a pretty key step in the process, and I think really important in creating a good broker relationship.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. In the case of the consumer packaged goods, broker's not our real estate agent. They're not someone helping to buy or sell stocks or our investments. They're an extension of our sales team. They're contract salespeople. And as you mentioned, they might be specific to a single account or might help you with your brand across the country, perhaps across all channels, as we refer to them, just classes of trade, right? And I think you mentioned an important part is, what does that broker do? What do I expect from them? We'll talk about those things. What should they expect from us? And we've worked, each of us, in a variety of roles. I've worked with a regional broker a number of times, a variety of regional brokers throughout my career. And being based in Central Texas, most of them that I worked with were here, based out of Austin. And then there are brokers, you go from that regional broker that might be natural, call on a Whole Foods or regional specialty stores, to what you mentioned. Maybe they have one account, right? A broker that focuses on Target or Sam's Club or Publix in the Southeast or HEB in Central Texas. And then within that, or you've got a handful of national brokers, and now more of them are going that way. Acosta, Presence, CA Fortune, there are others, and then regional brokers. And whether we're using a regional broker or one specialized to a class of trade, say one that focuses on club stores, you mentioned just their understanding of the retailer. What are some things that a new brand or an emerging brand, or maybe even an existing brand that's still getting their feet wet, so to speak, with brokers, what things should they keep in mind about what a broker, what they don't do, or maybe what I think they should do type things? What things should, what's a good starting place for us to help coach someone through that process?
So I think that there are a number of things that a brand that's considering a broker can some exercises I think that maybe they can go through
Hmm.
to sort of help out with that process. And coming back to the idea of like sort of what are your expectations for that broker? As we said, we all sort of have baseline expectations of the sales and administration portion of it. And I sort of said, what are the other definitions that you pour into it? And I think it's a good idea for new brands and people that are new to the industry in particular, um, to sit down and actually write down, make notes of the things that beyond that baseline you expect from a broker. And it can be a lot of different things. It can be, what is your cadence of communication? What is the speed of response when you reach out to them? What are, if you're hiring a team for, store coverage, what is the frequency of the store coverage that you expect? We can get all the way down to the point of like, what do you expect at a trade show? I mean, how many times on a Slack channel or LinkedIn do you hear somebody complaining that, oh, my broker didn't bring somebody over to me at a trade show? That's
Right.
probably not make or break, but if it's really important to you, you should know it, and you should write it down and keep track of it. So I think that's a good place for people to start, which is to sort of figure out what are the fill-in bits that you would be thinking of beyond just that basic sales and admin. And I think at the same time, it's a pretty good idea for people to take a personal inventory of what they know about themselves and how do they like people to work with them,
That's
and
great.
being able to define that and tell a potential broker that these are the expectations. This is something about my personality that's going to be important to our future relationship. These are all things that I think it's going to pay dividends if you sit down and you write them out so that you can think of them as bullet points for your future conversations with potential brokers as you vet them.
I think that's both aspects that are really important that you mentioned. One, making a list of your own expectations, especially things like cadence of communication. And I'll throw out for those who will listen or watch, weekly calls are unlikely to be important in the beginning. Well, maybe as a brand is onboarding, if Bryan's Widgets is onboarding with Dan, wasn't a fractional sales strategist and sales manager, but a broker, you ran a national brokerage. In the beginning, there might be weekly calls as we're onboarding, but as we're going, we're probably not having weekly calls because call cycles are easily 30 days. If I'm visiting independent retailers, it's a 30-day call cycle for most brokers. Sometimes it's longer if those retail account managers for the broker are calling on B stores, not A stores. And so, cadence of communication and also being willing to take some feedback on that, because I might want weekly meetings, but they might not be appropriate for every single situation. And you're right, that knowing myself and how I prefer to communicate or to be communicated with, that will be very helpful, right? If I can be transparent as a brand and as the person who's going to be connecting with that brokerage. In the case of emerging brands, it's usually the founder, right? They may not have a sales manager yet. They are the sales manager, they're marketing, they're manufacturing, they're doing it all. But being very transparent there is pretty significant. I think those are very, very helpful things. So having that checklist of what do I expect from the broker, having a way to share with them my expectations, but how to communicate best with me. My temperament, do I prefer text, email, smoke signal, whatever it might be, being very transparent there. And then what are some things that probably most brokers don't do? Well, I'll build on one you had mentioned before, and that is maybe brokers aren't responsible overall for my brand's profitability. They're responsible for different things. But if we were telling a new brand that your broker's generally not responsible for your profitability, you gave a great example, but what would that what potentially could that mean, so that the both the broker understands that they do, but for that new brand, what would that mean to them when you say, hey, that broker, whether it's Acosta or Dan's boutique brokerage that focuses in Florida, what would that mean to the brand? What would they have to keep in mind when we tell them the broker is really not responsible for your profitability?
Yeah, the primary focus and function of the broker is sales. So it isn't your cost of goods, and it isn't your internal margin, and it isn't a lot of the things that are really, really important to your survival as a business.
Right.
It's the responsibility of the brand owner to be in charge of all of those numbers, to have control and to have an understanding of all of those things. And it's important that you know those things because whoever the specialist is, whether it's the single person or it's the key account executive for a really desirable retailer for you, they're going to come to you with opportunities. Those opportunities, you've got to vet them because they come with a cost. There's I think an example that I've given is, like maybe there's a 6-store natural chain that they have an ad program that costs $1,500 for whatever the period of time is. This is potentially an opportunity, but only you as a brand owner, as somebody who's in charge of the profitability of the company, can run those numbers based on your cost of goods and see, what do I expect to get out of this based on my velocities, based on the sales and execution. The broker's job, as we've said a number of times, it is sales, and this is a tool. This opportunity for an ad is a tool that their key account likes to have filled. It's their job to kind of help get that done, but it's up to you to decide whether or not that opportunity makes sense.
Appreciate that. Yes, the broker should be an expert at that retailer. That the example of the 6-store chain, right? They should come back to the brand and say, oh, you know what, this retailer, in cap programs for your category of product are best. Here's the cost of the ad. This is approximately what you might expect in terms of an order. Does it make it right? The brand needs to do the math on does it make sense, or perhaps maybe even provide a tool. But ultimately, you're right. If I'm a broker, I'm trying to get us on shelf, trying to get those ads or promotions. And then the brand is going to need to be very conscious of what those costs are. So I think that makes good sense. What else might the broker do or not do that these emerging brands need to be thoughtful of?
Well, I would also say, like I've said a couple of times, the admin capabilities are really something that you want to have as part of the conversation. If we're going to talk a little bit later about sort of when do you need a broker, If you're a founder who has gotten in the trenches and has gone out and done the sales for yourself and gone out and gone out and secured a few accounts, and now you have the ongoing management, it might actually be the admin portion of your business that drives you to seeking out a broker sooner than the need for sales. But understanding what all is, what is included in that admin, I think is really important. They can manage your paperwork to distributors. They can manage your paperwork to the retailers. They can help manage your calendar, but it's not anybody's job to actually do the work and say, this is what I need you to do. That's the job of whoever it is that's liaising with the broker.
Yeah, that makes sense. And right, because they're within that distributor side. You mentioned like paperwork, promotions, new item setups. Most of the two large distributors, UNFI, KHE, each have their own portal, pulling data from that. In your experience, do you find many brokers will manage the portal data, or does that tend to fall back to the brand? And maybe you have a preference one way or the other.
I mean, I have a preference if a broker has the capabilities of doing that, I love that, because it is something that it can be time consuming. I say that as somebody who loves to get in and play around with the data and see what I can see for myself,
Mm-hmm.
which, that's a personal preference. It's not for everybody, and it's not it's not a requirement, but a good, well-developed broker team will certainly have that capability to pull the information, and it's going to vary. Are you going to get analytics? That is going to vary widely based on the broker that you choose.
And that makes sense, yes, because there is a lot of information, a lot of data there, turning it into usable information, and that makes sense. That's good to be aware of. And another thing I think when it comes to the broker side, they are an extension of the sales team. I don't know if they're a true replacement for it. I probably many brokerages strive to act that way. And maybe some of them are, in all fairness, where they have really competent account managers. Their HEB account manager, their Publix account manager for the brokerage is very good at what they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're a replacement for the brand's sales manager, national sales manager, whatever they might call that person, whatever that role is, depending on the breadth of it. Is that fair, or you disagree that the broker is not, they're not a replacement for your VP of sales or your sales manager?
No, I would agree with that, and I think probably most brokers would also agree with it. I mean, it isn't. And again, we're painting with somewhat of a broad brush, so it's not everybody, but the strategy sort of has to remain on the side of the brand, whether that's the founder and the entrepreneur, or whether that's somebody that's put in place to sort of help manage the strategy. Regardless of the size of the broker, they survive and they are successful based on processes and consistency within the universe that they do business in. So they need to be able to look at your brand and all of the things that we've talked about, and be comfortable that they can integrate you and your brand into their systems and processes, not the other way around. So it's up to you to be there, to stay in that relationship and represent yourself and your own brand.
It makes sense. And brokers, they don't do this for free. They're compensated. There's a variety of compensation forms. There's a retainer, and the retainer is just fancy for there's a floor. There's the minimum amount they're willing to be paid, because usually a retainer is in lieu of commission, somewhere between 3 and 10%. I say, depending on the item and the channel, that retainer is the floor. If your brand's not selling enough yet to meet that minimum, you're on a retainer. Supplement brands tend to towards, not always, might be at a higher commission rate. They might be, if it's a direct brand into a retailer, it might be closer to that 10%. If you're white wave and you're silk, you might be less than 3%, because your commission check to that brokerage is going to be tens of millions of dollars, millions of dollars a month, right? Tens of millions a year potentially. So, but the brands will be working with those emerging brands. The retainer, there's a commission, there's commission only brokers, and there's fee only brokers. And usually depends on, well, a variety of things. Fee only brokers, maybe they're out there handling just specialized brands at that early stage, but that will play into, we'll talk about, as you mentioned a little bit, when to bring on that the broker or brokers on the brand to the brand. But that's something to that the brands have to really think about, because so often, I think we probably both experienced this, where a brand will be emerging, they'll hear a broker pitch or the idea of a broker handling whatever they think is an account that is best for their brand, and if they're paying a retainer, which is often the case, or a fee of some sort, if it's thousands of dollars a month, but it might be a 6 or 12 month process, the brand really has to ask themselves, we have that amount of capital, we have that runway, if you will, of cash to pay the retainer. And it's not that the broker's not working during that time. If the category review is in January and the refresh is in August, there's a lot of work that still goes into that. And there are category reviews in between. But as you're the brand, you have to be very thoughtful that just because that brand has a great relationship with a number of retailers, you sign them on day one, you're probably not on the shelf on day 30 or day 60, right? What are some things around that the payment side that brands should be thoughtful of based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, category review schedules are definitely something that should be part of the conversation. In addition to sort of the homework that I gave everybody at the very beginning, I would say you should be able to go into that meeting with a list, and you decide how long it is, but with a list of your top desired accounts. And you may not know whether those are accounts that work off of a category review schedule or not. I promise you, some of them will, and the timeline will be similar to what you just described, Bryan. But having that and sort of knowing that these are your targets will be helpful, I think, in examining, what's on the table for all of the people that you are going to be talking to. And the models that they will come at. Retainers is definitely one of those things that contributes to some of the more intense reactions in the, when brands are talking about their experiences with brokers. But if you're emerging and you're breaking into a business, I mean, I gotta say, it's never going to be harder than when you're starting out. To go out and get those accounts. And your brokers are working hard for you. Pioneering is hard work, and it's completely justified for them to ask for payment while they're doing this work. What are you roped into? Is there a time limit? That was probably not the right word. Roped into is a little bit strong, but like what are you being encouraged? I mean, if you have a specific idea of what it is that you want, it also helps you focus and not have to pay for something that you don't need. And that should be part of all of those vetting conversations as well.
Yes.
A broker organization has to pay its bills. So it's not unusual for them to require a minimum amount of coverage. And we're talking about bigger brokers here, not necessarily the specialty or the regionals. That is one of those areas where it can start to get a little, the relationship can start to intensify a little bit if you're being forced into something that is not in what you determine to be your best interest for that period of time.
No, that makes good sense. Things that a broker would assume that a brand is going to be responsible for. We talked about that list for those emerging brands listing. The brokers, by and large, are going to expect, and add to this, they're going to expect that that brand is ready to hand off the tools that they will need to go to the retailer for sell in, etc. Sell sheets, spec lists, pricing sheets, understands trade spend, meaning that the dollars we're going to invest into that retailer, right? Not the outside marketing to drive awareness, but what am I going to spend at Sprouts or Publix or whomever the account is. The broker's going to expect the brand to have that ready. Sometimes emerging brands, they have some ideas, they have bits and pieces. Maybe they're optimized for direct to consumer, which will be a little different than going into the brick and mortar side of things. But the broker is going to have they're also going to have that baseline expectation that the brands are prepared margin wise, tools, samples, the ability to support that, especially if you have a product that should and could be sampled by, not only the buyer, of course, but if you're into accounts where you can leave samples behind, do they have Have they planned for those things? Brokers will probably assume that production is in the hands of the brand. Those emerging brands, they have to be very thoughtful too, because if you get into even a chain, Fresh Time's a good size chain, but it's 75, 80 stores. If you've only been selling regionally or direct to consumer, and you've not been in a chain of that size, getting in there, or Sprouts at almost 500 stores now, I think 480-ish is the count. Being able to produce that amount of product is really important. So understanding production and being able to communicate with the broker the kind of things that they would need back from the broker in order to make sure capacity is there. What might be, well, I know on our list, jargon. Brokers can help the brand with jargon, but might be a good idea. We can develop a cheat sheet that we can hand out, but jargon is something that's going to come up. OIs and MCBs and chargebacks, and my goodness, just a plethora of new
Stands and
acronyms.
standbacks and
Yes.
DSD and yeah, we could go on for quite a while, and that is one of the things that I think you would experience as like sort of an expectation of a broker, that you're familiar not just with the terms of the jargon, but also their meaning, because it's very easy for those of us that have been in this for a long time, and anybody who's made it sort of their day-to-day life for, let's just say, more than 6 or 9 months. Things like, oh, we're going to do we're going to do a 15 OI with a 10% MCB layered up on top of it. Things like that just fall out of our mouths. And our assumption, whether it's somebody in the role that you and I are in, or whether it's a broker, is that all of these things, the real math that's behind all of that. One, you understand what that means. And two, the math that actually happens behind the curtain is you're going to understand that as the brand owner or as the contact for the broker, which goes to the point we were talking to earlier about the profitability and your internal margins. That's on you as the brand owner. So it is something that's going to be, it's table stakes, in the conversations that you're having with brokers.
Yes. And your broker, you also mentioned, they'll be involved in your distributor management, right? And for these emerging brands, you don't often really have a choice unless you're the rare emerging brand that was direct to consumer first, and in such, you're probably doing tens of millions of dollars, maybe a month, and you've been online now. You're doing $1 million a month on Amazon. Now you're moving into brick and mortar. Maybe you have a little more control, but even then, if you're going into Sprouts, they're going to ask to be in you're going to be in KeHE, right? If you're presenting to Whole Foods, or especially Whole Foods, if they like your snack item or your frozen item, it's going to be pushed to UNFI, right? So emerging brands, some of that you have a choice, most of it you don't. And your brokers, they are going to intuitively know this, just like brokers play a key role in our business. And the better you understand them, and distributors are the same way. And you mentioned, the jargon and the math, right? Your OI is going to be that off invoice. You get a discount from what their purchase price from the distributor pays the manufacturer, and that MCB is a discount off of wholesale that the retailer gets from the distributor, and that math is different, right? The
Right.
10% of wholesale is distinctly different than 10% of distributor cost. And the the broker will generally expect the brand to understand that. And that is where people like you and I come in to help these emerging brands, if they're not already familiar with it, to help them understand and help them plan and prepare for that. And probably a good way to bring it all together is thinking about when what are the steps that brand, a good emerging brand, goes through, and how can we help them to understand when they should hire a broker? What does that look like? When do they need to be really thinking, when do I hire a broker?
So the specifics of hiring, there could be any number of important inflection points, and I alluded to one earlier when I was talking about maybe the admin of your existing accounts is becoming overwhelming to you. Maybe the universe of accounts from a sales perspective is becoming overwhelming for you. These are some of the key points that you would certainly look at, opportunities to kind of take something off of your plate as a founder and entrepreneur, right? Um, and is the broker the way to go about doing it? I mean, there are definitely times when that's the case. All of the things that we've talked about sort of up until now are things that along the way, before you reach those inflection points, it
Mm,
would be if you've done sort of the exercise, and I called it the homework, earlier. If you think through and you really sort of, write those things down, all of the things about, how do they work with you? What are your expectations beyond basic sales and all that becomes a template then for the conversations that you're going to have, so you've really you've defined and honed what your expectations are. And I don't want anybody to come away from it at this point and feel like if that's what you write your expectations are, you're going to get 100% of your expectations. You're not going to get 100% of your expectations. But those are the things that you negotiate beyond just what is the compensation model and the rest. So to go back to Bryan's example, if your expectation is that I'm going to have weekly calls on an ongoing basis, your broker in almost every case, I would say, is probably going to say, one, it's not necessary, and two, I don't have the time for it. It's not an effective use of time. So that's a negotiating point where you say, okay, what can you live with and what can they live with that fits within their processes and consistency? And that's where, if you create that and you sort of have it as a checklist, you and whoever you're interviewing, then sort of say, okay, these are the things that we agreed on, and that becomes how you can scorecard going forward in that relationship. So if you agreed that we're going to have monthly phone calls, you've got it. You all have agreed on it. If you agree or they agree that if you call, text, or email, somebody's going to get back to you within 48 hours, you've agreed on that. You have every right to hold whoever, the members of that team accountable for that.
correct.
Accountability at the end of the day is where so many, accountability and I would just say misaligned expectations are where so many of the sort of brand broker challenges come up. And a lot of times it's not over big things, it's over small things like this.
Yeah, we probably can't underscore that enough. Where the expectations were not clearly discussed and then not holding people accountable to those expectations when they have been clarified. Yes, and then that holding them accountable, that if I'm the brand, you're the broker, holding you accountable is how we ensure each other's success. That accountability flows both ways. I said, well, Dan, yes, I will provide your team with the things you've asked for, samples on this basis. Here's the trade spend, things of this nature. You're able also to hold, if you're the broker, you get to hold that brand accountable. And that's important to do. But ultimately, then in this relationship, if the brand does their homework well, like you said, clear expectations, we're holding them accountable. The brand then sets those goals and holds the broker accountable. That SMART goals, they're specific, they're measurable, they are achievable. We want to make it, and then they're they're uh, they're time based. So the brand will be responsible as much as the broker, I believe, in terms of success, in terms of setting those goals, holding them accountable. And then what are some other? I think we're doing it. I think we're getting close to that wrapping up. But I think within those expectations too, and that's probably where much of it falls. Right, that brand has to think, okay, within this is the place I want the brand to be. This is our budget, and then really understanding what your budget is, and if it's $500 a month or $5,000 a month. Some national brokers, right, their retainer is 10 or 12,000 a month. At an early stage, if a brand is bootstrapped, that would be a ton of money. But if you're an emerging brand if you've gained, let's say, some national placement with a Whole Foods or a Sprouts, a really good broker that only charges you 12.5 a month, that might be a fantastic value because you're getting, if you were in multiple chains, you're getting account managers across the country. It would be impossible to hire your own team or even manage boutique brokers effectively for maybe that amount of money, right? But that trying to understand not only your expectation, your budget, how long that budget will last, I think is important too, right? Uh, how much runway do I have with whatever, my $500 a month or my $15,000 a month? What are some other
Right.
things around this, that the hiring of the broker, the when and timing?
Well, I think that the budget. I think we've hit on pretty much the main things that we should, right? I mean, it's knowing yourself and knowing your expectations and being able to find an agreement with a group that seems to be able to deliver effectively what it is your expectations are, and at the price that you can. Just going back to the idea, because the idea of you being responsible for your own profitability. You have to understand, and as Bryan, it was a good example. Like 12.5 a month seems like a lot of money, but there's a scenario where that really does become something that is a great value to you. And it could stretch a brand, but part of all of this is if you've got your visibility, if you've got transparency internally to your numbers,
Mm-hmm.
it's up to you to make the decision. And we're talking we're talking about it in the context of working and deciding and when are you ready to get a broker, but all of that still applies. We gave the example of the 6-store chain and the $1,500 ad. You may, as a brand, feel like that's a good choice, but you want to make all of these decisions based on your knowledge of the state of your business, not because you feel like this is the right time to get a broker, or because you feel like I need to, it should always make sense because it always comes back to the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes great, great points. And probably as the emerging brands get out there early on, it's probably a good idea to begin to meet and communicate with brokers, right? Whether it's through LinkedIn, trade events, get to know a variety before you need them as you're building that list. I think can be a real helpful thing, sort of in the vein of brands that might seek funding to help grow their business. It's probably good to start building relationships with the private equity venture capital people long before you need a check. In the same way that if I'm an emerging brand and I'm not familiar with this space, then as you're developing that list, which I think is super important, start to build that list and start to just interact with brokers again for a variety of reasons. There's many in every category. You want to find one that obviously can meet your expectations as you're developing them. In that beginning stage, you can begin to again get a feel for brokers. You can ask them questions about what they're doing and begin to refine your list so that when you're really ready to sit down, you'll still be negotiating because you're right, Daniel. I'll be sharing my way of communicating with you at Dan's brokerage. You'll be sharing your preferences. But if I've had some discussions with a variety of brokers, I might have refined that list a bit and maybe made some adjustments that'll help it be a little smoother as we sit down and I go through that process of thinking, oh yeah, I'm at this place. I believe I need a regional broker because I'm focusing on Texas. I want to focus on HEB or Central Market and these areas. So I'm looking for that category of broker. If I've spoken to some, probably going to have a little easier chance than trying to uh, build those relationships 2 or 3 months before I want to sign the broker. Does that make sense, or is there maybe a better way to do that?
I think that's it's a great piece of advice. Expand your network, before you need it is great advice. And you'll wind up meeting people that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. If you take the advice, if you attend a trade show or some sort of event, be out there, pass out cards or share your your electronic contact information, however it works. When people will call you back. If you're a brand saying that I'm thinking about potentially looking for some coverage and some representation, people will call you back.
Absolutely. And so also for emerging brands, make sure there's startup CPG. There are a number of groups that handle emerging brands, and then meet guys like Dan who are upstream from the broker side, because before you get to them, you want, if sales in this industry aren't your background, you're the inventor, if you will. You've created a better widget of some sort, a better beverage, a better snack, a better hair care line, or a better supplement of some sort. But this industry is not where your home base is, so to speak, then connecting with guys like Dan who understand that. That'll be one more way to be introduced to brokers, to ask these questions and to help filter out the broker who, as you get that list developed, can help point you in the direction. Here are two or three really great brokers or brokerages in that category, to be one additional layer of filtering to, okay, yeah, instead of going through 25, here's three good ones that Dan recommended that he's worked with and found that would be a fit for my chip company or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, there's lots of variables, all through, through almost every decision-making process that's involved in this industry, and certainly for representation is not any different than any of the rest of them. Um, there are a lot of variables that you are probably going to have to work through from every side of things, and it's a big business. And just as we started off talking about extremes between what people believe about brokers generally and all of the space in between, brokers are sort of the same way. And the best preparation that I think brands can make is to really be clear with their own standards
Yes.
before you really get into starting to have serious conversations. Talk to them at all the trade shows, collect as many business cards and all of that as you can, but have those things ready when you're ready to start in.
I think that's probably the very best advice. Have that list, have it refined as much as you can, then start having those discussions and connect with guys like Dan, connect with others at those trade shows so that you can begin to build a network so that when you're ready to sit down and talk, it's a lot easier. So Dan, thank you for today. I appreciate it. And hopefully some folks will find this to be of value and they can begin their own checklist of things they need to do as they're doing homework. So when it comes time to find a broker, it'll be a little smoother for them.
I hope so. It was my pleasure, Bryan. Thanks for having me.